Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Natalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Natalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. Welcome to a special series of podcast episodes in honor of the 10th anniversary of my first book, Grieving Parents, Surviving Loss as a Couple, published in 2014. To mark this milestone, I'm reconnecting with the same parents I initially interviewed for the book, offering a unique opportunity to revisit their stories and gain a deeper understanding of their journeys, now with the perspective of a decade's time. In recognition of October being Pregnancy and Infant Loss Awareness Month, this series is dedicated to showcasing how grieving parents have coped with their losses and trauma over these years. These episodes aim to offer a long-term view of life after the loss of a pregnancy or an infant, providing comfort, insight and hope to those who may still be navigating their own grief. Additionally, I'm excited to offer Healing Steps, my audio course, at 25% off this month. Use the coupon code HSOCT24, I repeat HSOCT24, to access the course and begin your own journey towards healing. So here today with me is Rachel. Now Rachel, it's been 10 years since we first spoke, and for the interview series I conducted in the research for the book Grieving Parents, Surviving Loss as a Couple, and we are here again today. So first of all, let's just take a look into where you are in your life right now. How are you today? How is your life today, 10 years later? And where do you stand today, since, given the fact that it's 16 years since the death of your twin baby girls, Aubrey and Ellie? And what have you done since then? And where are you today?
A lot has happened in a decade. I do find it very interesting that since that interview, I am no longer married to the father of my children. So I have gone through a divorce. I do remember at the time of that interview, I already knew that my marriage was in trouble. It had been in trouble for quite a while. I don't believe grief caused my divorce. I think the loss of the girls magnified and amplified a lot of the problems that were going on. I do not and never have blamed the loss of my marriage on the loss of the girls at all. It's a different thing. So I find that interesting, and I remarried since. And I think back on this decade, and two things immediately come to mind. It is amazing what kind of progress you can make in 10 years. I think we underestimate. I think sometimes we get so focused on what we can do in a year that we forget what we can do in 10. And we need that macro view sometimes instead of that micro view to keep reminding ourselves that life is way bigger and it lasts a lot longer and that there's more going on than sometimes it seems when we're really in the throes of grief in those early years after loss. And then I also think about this last 10 years, this decade, and I think, wow, how much more there is to come. And I think that's been the biggest shift for me. And really I found it so interesting when you reached out, because really these last 2 or 3 months in my life have been another shift in awareness to realizing that I have not yet even come close to the full potential that is available to me in my life, and that there's still more, and that I'm not done, and that I think I put my head down and focused so long on getting myself through my grief and then getting others through the acute stages of their grief that I didn't lift my head for a while to dream, to set different goals, to look around I just posted on Instagram a while back saying, if you think this is all that there is for you, you're mistaken. There's always something more. There's always something new. There's always something next. And I think that's where I find myself really embracing life right now, is going, okay, what is next? Because I'm not done. And that was one of the things I promised my girls, is that I would never stop or be done. And it's not a striving. It's not like I'm driving myself forward. It's just I didn't ever want to allow their loss to make my world too small when it's bigger than I even realize it is sometimes. So I think this decade has been this really important transition into something exciting, something beautiful, something, I don't know, that just feels like something more. I don't know. I can't exactly put my finger. I couldn't even tell you exactly what it is. It's just this sense of life is going to keep growing and building, and it's up to me to participate and decide to what level I want to continue to participate. That there's loss hasn't actually limited me the way we often get that messaging that it does. I think that's unfortunately one of the lies of the grief community, is that loss somehow puts this limit or this cap on you. It changes you, it changes your life, it changes your perspective. I don't think we're ever the same, but I no longer view it as something limiting. It's just changing, but not limiting.
Yeah, so two things you mentioned that I picked up, and it comes back to me as you speak. So one of the things that you mentioned is, which you previously mentioned to me, which is that you made a promise to the girls that you'd learn how to heal after loss, and for the last years that you have made good on your promise, and you also help clients do that. And so just to give a little bit of the timeline for people listening or watching this, is that, so we did the interview maybe a little bit more than 10 years ago, maybe. And so that was like 5 years post the loss of Aubrey and Ellie. And then it's 10 years since the release of the book. And one of the things you mentioned was your marriage. And at the time, I remember when I spoke to you, listening to what you were saying about how the marriage was affected, because basically Grieving Parents, Surviving Loss as a Couple was really about how does a couple survive that, how they individually survive, and how do they deal with that as a couple. And one of the things you said, amongst many other things, was the girl's death didn't cause new problems in our relationship. It just stirred up all the old ones. And so this is just one little snippet, like gem, that I used for the book, because I remembered from our interview, you said so many poignant things that I actually said, Rachel should write a relationship book for people grieving the loss of a child, because everything you said was basically worthy to go into a book, according to what I heard you say at that time. And for me, in that case, when I had the interview with you, I was just probably a little bit more than a year after the loss of my daughter. So in my case, this was good advice from you, to hear from you. But let's have a look at the relationship, because you mentioned one of the interesting things that happened in the past 10 years. You got divorced and now you're remarried. What do you think how is the relationship between the loss of Aubrey and Ellie to the relationship, or the problems in the relationship with your husband or the father of the girls? What would you say now, looking back with that perspective? How much effect did that have, and how long after that interview did you then get separated and divorced?
So I thought about this a lot, and so hopefully I can speak into this with some clarity. I had sort of convinced myself before Aubrey and Ellie ever even passed away that even though there were some major problems in my marriage, that somehow if life got really hard, we would be able to overcome that we would persevere through really difficult things. And then a really difficult thing happened, and I saw an amplification of all of the other dysfunctions. And what I learned is that my thought process was completely naive, that character is not created in hardship, it's revealed. And it's hard work to repair character through hardship. It's possible, absolutely possible, but it's hard work. And when life gets the hardest, it reveals the cracks, the weaknesses. And unless you're very, very committed to then mending those and fixing those, they don't fix themselves. External things don't fix internal problems. Like those were things going on in our marriage inside each one of us, right? There's this element to all marriages where you have to do your own work, and you can't do enough work that you also can do their work too. Like each person has to commit to doing their own work and then coming together that way to work together. We didn't really have that. And I don't want to speak too much into some of the specifics because I don't feel like it's fair to my ex to claim that I knew what he was feeling or thinking or what his motives were, because I don't, and he's not here to speak, into it. But I know for myself is it was just an enormous lesson of being honest with myself. And if things are not okay, nothing bigger or worse or harder magically fixes that or makes them okay. Things just get shakier and more wobbly. And support does matter. Support is not the only thing that matters. But if you're in a relationship where that support just really isn't there, and you have incorrect or unfair expectations around what that support should look like, it can get really, really tricky to navigate loss. But the point is, it wasn't even about trying to figure out how to recover from losing Aubrey Nellie. It was just another example of the things that we could not seem to get through.
Mm-hmm.
And the list was just growing. I think what was hardest, though, is when Aubrey Nellie died, for me, and I've seen this with my clients as well, the grief shrinks your bandwidth significantly.
Yeah,
so what you
absolutely.
used to be able to ignore, tolerate, put up with, modify, deal with, you name it, I just didn't have that capacity anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I was barely getting out of bed and making sure my 2-year-old, my 2.5-year-old was okay. And so the whole idea of now taking on deeper, bigger marriage problems, I just couldn't do it. I did not have the bandwidth for it. And so I very much sort of went into my shell and put my focus on my own personal responsibility. I think I even say something in the book at a certain point is that we have to give our spouses the freedom to grieve their own way, and we have to take responsibility for what we need in our support system. And I still believe that and not even just in a marriage, in any situation. One of the things that I see, especially with my clients, breaks their heart the most is they have these expectations that people are going to show up for them in a certain way or be there for them or help them in a certain way, and they don't. And there is this reality of loss and of grief that we are 100% responsible for our own inner world. And if we're trying to convince or make the external world take responsibility for our internal world, we will be very frustrated and very disappointed. Absolutely. Because our healing is our responsibility, full stop. And that can be a big pill to swallow in a marriage, because we want to believe, especially when you lose a child, right? Our spouse is the only other person who's lost that child, right? We want to say, you should know what I'm going through. You should meet me where I'm at. We should be on the same page. And that's just not how it is. It's not that black and white and that crystal clear. It's murky and it's complicated. And we all have our own baggage and our own personality and our own perspectives and our own belief systems and all these things that either help us become equipped to manage our grief and get through it, or are a detriment to that. And sort of putting that responsibility on someone else, especially a spouse, can be too much sometimes, and it can create a lot of stress and strain. And I'm not saying that I put that on my spouse. I did not put it on him to say, you should help me more. But I did realize very quickly that I wasn't going to get any of that support from him, and that I was going to have to figure out another way. Because if I was hoping or waiting for that, it wasn't coming.
But yeah,
and I needed a better plan.
Yeah, I think it's very common that couples who experience the loss of a child, obviously they lose the same relationship at the same time. So the stressor on the nervous system is exactly at the same time, and it's the same kind, let's call it this way. Obviously the relationship is not the same, but it's the child. But one of the things you mentioned in relation to that was that you are so thrown back onto yourself. And this is one of the things that I talk about in the book as well, is that, first of all, surviving loss as a couple in the book is described as, first you have to survive it for yourself. You have to deal with your own grief. And then if there is, and very often at the beginning, especially in your grief, there isn't much bandwidth, as you called it, left over to deal with someone else. And as you said, it's not their responsibility. So one of the things you said in the interview was, I focused on managing my own grief and not managing my husband's grief. I let him do that himself. And I guess one of the things I see with my clients is often that one of the two comes to see me and is dealing with it, or is looking after themselves, is getting support to deal with it. And one partner may not be there yet, may never be there, may have different views, different ways to do it, or not do it at all, or apparently not do it at all kinds of versions without going into it. And it's that disconnection between the ways that people travel, especially in a marriage, or especially in a relationship where they lose, as I said, have the same loss at the same time. But then the travel through that with that is so different.
Yeah, it can be starkly different. And that's not necessarily something bad or something wrong. Like I said, my marriage did not ultimately end because we couldn't circumnavigate losing our Renelli. That wasn't the case at all. There was lots of other reasons why our marriage ended. And, we stayed married almost an entire decade after Aubrey and Ellie's loss. It wasn't something that happened instantly either. It's way more complicated. And one of the things that I have learned over the last 16 years is it's so important not to try to oversimplify very complicated things.
Exactly.
We need to do complicated things in steps and actually honor the fact that they are complicated, because life is not just a bunch of easy answers. And my marriage cannot be summed up into one moment or one day or one epiphany, right? It was 13 years of stuff that eventually, in my mind, felt insurmountable. And then the marriage ended. But Aubrey and Ellie did not end my marriage.
Yeah, I think it's
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important what you're saying. It's not that the children's death or the child's death or the baby's death is the cause. It's one of the parts of that whole story. And I was just thinking when you were talking, we were married nearly a decade after the loss of Aubrey and Ellie. And I was looking at my situation because I am also divorced since the loss of my child. But again, even if we were to say, yes, my marriage was also divorced about 10 years after the loss, it doesn't make it a rule. It doesn't make it, okay, couples after the loss of a child separate or divorce after 10 years at least or before. Even those statistics, they don't just fit a neat way of giving a rule to a situation.
Well, and I think, yes, that's so true. And I often find something I've especially learned how to do better, for when Aubrey and Ellie died, at first, everything in my life was seen through the filter of their loss. My grief was a filter for pretty much everything. And as I learned how to heal and grow and just nourish and nurture myself and just live a different way, I was able to see that not everything in my life was tainted by my loss and my grief. And it helped me get a little better view of my marriage, to look at that, yes, it played a part, and it, like you described, it was a part of the story, but it wasn't the determining factor. And even as a parent raising my children, I have a really wonderful girlfriend. We're both raising teenagers, and every once in a while, I will call her and say, oh, no, I'm having trouble with one of my children. I'm struggling in parenting somehow, and call her for encouragement. And my fear will always be, oh, this is a product of the divorce, right? This is happening because my children are dealing with a divorce or facing a divorce. And she'll always laugh at me and say, my children are not from a divorced family, and they do all of those same things, or we're struggling with that exact same thing. The point being, that filter is not necessarily a correct way to look at everything through. Divorce is actually not a part of every single thing going on in my life. Losing Aubrey and Ellie is not actually a part of every single thing that has gone on in my life. And being able to sit back and have that perspective and say, yes, it influenced this or that or these things, but it also doesn't actually have anything to do with this over here. Basically, I've learned not to paint with such a broad brush, right? And to allow it to be part of the story, to be an informing factor, but not make it the center or the cause or the reason for everything that has gone on from the moment that I lost them. Because it's not fair to the situation. And more importantly, it's not fair to them. Those poor little girls, they just, it wasn't their fault they died either. And they're actually not the reason for everything. They are my reason a lot of times for living as well as I can, being grateful, working hard. I do want to honor them with my life, but they are not to blame. They are just sweet and innocent. And it was a tragedy losing them, and giving myself that permission and freedom to say life would be complicated even if they didn't die. My marriage might have ended even if they were still here. I don't really know. I only know what I can know because this is what's happened and this has been my experience. But to make assumptions that this event was, created this event, which would have never happened with this other event, that sort of diminishes the role that our choices play in our life. And the older I get, the more I survive after loss, and not just survive, but really revive and then thrive. The more I see that how we respond to those things has way more influence and power in how life goes than the fact that those things happened at all. And that power of choice seems to be the hill I die on in all areas. I believe in our capacity to make choices, to make new choices, to unmake old choices. That is ultimately what creates our life. That you don't just kick over one domino and now you just have to deal with the fallout. That's too easy.
I was just wondering how much of that idea of wanting to make rules or wanting to make comparisons or wanting to understand and say, okay, if this happens, therefore that happens, and this is because of that. I wonder how much of that is part of the nature of the mind, wanting to have control. Because as we know, it's often a desire to have control. And if we've experienced a great significant loss, then we feel helpless in that, oh my God, I can't control this. Things like that happen without me doing anything. And it's the brain's nature to say, okay, what if I can control? At least I can understand why it happened, or, like the cause of death as an example, but also the cause of the like with those numbers that they say, like 95% or whatever of the marriages will dissolve after the loss of a child. So this is, I don't even want to say the number, but they just ask a simple question. Like, so if you lost a child, how long after that did you divorce? Like whether, as you were just saying, whether that marriage would have been ending with or without the loss, we don't know because we don't have the sliding door effect. One of the things you also said on our conversation was the best advice that I got during counseling was, don't judge your spouse's grief response. Give them the freedom to grieve their own way. Now looking back to this sentence, because I think that's, honestly, if I look at it, it's a very difficult thing to do. Like even I have been at fault of wanting to steer my ex-husband into one way of grieving, or had an idea of how it should be done, or was wishing he would be more or less of something. How was that for you?
Yeah, well, I think that statement is still true, but incomplete. I think now with this many years under my belt, I would say that, yes, it is important not to judge, and not just your spouse's, but really anyone's grief response.
Yeah.
But choosing not to judge, and I think really what I meant in that was sort of require or demand that he grieve a certain way or share my grief experience, that there needed to be freedom there. But also what I've learned too, that I did, in my opinion, very poorly back then, is I also didn't require any accountability. Like, we were still married. We were still a husband and a wife. We did still need each other. And giving your spouse permission to grieve their own way is not the same thing as giving them permission to abandon the relationship emotionally. And I think I didn't know what that line was or what that difference is. So I gave him a lot of freedom to just vacate without consequence. And that added up. And 10 years later, there just wasn't a relationship anymore.
When you say
And
vacate, what do you specifically mean?
Meaning just sort of emotionally disconnect and check out. Like he just wasn't very emotionally present. We were just at a very, it was sort of like, you just do you, I'll just do me, and we won't depend on each other, need each other, talk about it anymore. Like it just became our own personal thing to deal with. Mm-hmm. And when you're in a marriage, that can be really detrimental because you don't get married just so you can do your life alone. Mm-hmm. And he does him and you do you. And I think part of that was just the complete lack of energy at the time. I didn't have it in me to kind of figure that out or fight through that. I think the other part of it was just being younger and naive and not having the perspective that I have now. I'm sure there's a lot of factors, but I counsel my clients differently, where we do give space and we do work on not comparing, and we don't want to have unfair expectations of the people in our life and how they show up for us. But we're also allowed to ask for what we need. And if people can't provide that for us, to go find it in another healthy way, because grieving alone or just sort of saying, well, I guess I can figure this out myself, is actually a dangerous place to be, because we do need support through grief, and healing is actually not something that we just do by ourselves. It's our responsibility to heal, but part of that responsibility is bringing in a viable support system so that our needs can be met through the hardest time of our life. And that took me a number of years to really wrap my head around, as I was trying so hard not to judge his grief response that I stopped respecting myself in that aspect, and had such low standards that it did cause harm. It did cause pain. And it was ultimately, at least from my perspective, unrecoverable for us. Mm.
So the next part that you said actually makes sense in relation to what you just said about his way of responding. But let's have a look at what would you say now instead, or how has this evolved? So you said at the time it caused him a lot of pain to talk about the girls, and it caused me a lot of pain not to talk about the girls. Early on, I realized I had to find other people to listen to me, because he couldn't do it. What would you say about this now?
Yeah, so I still see that dynamic a lot, and it is a dynamic that I respect differently now, and even counsel my clients to handle differently, because it is important to respect and understand people's limitations and boundaries.
Yeah, absolutely.
For some people, talking about the girls is hard. For me, it wasn't. And I
guess for you it was necessary even, right?
Yes, it was really necessary. But I did figure out who I could talk to. I did find some amazing listeners in my life. And I was not bitter. That was not an area of bitterness. And it wasn't as much talking about the girls. We just sort of stopped talking at all. And I think if I still would have had the capacity to still talk and, share how we were feeling, understand a little bit better about what was going on with him, it wasn't necessarily that I had this hard line of like, if you can't talk about the girls with me, you're not supporting me. It wasn't that at all. But there has to be some kind of happy medium here where I can respect your limitations, but also it's not an all or nothing scenario where we either just don't talk at all, or we have to only talk about Aubrey Nelly because that's what helps me, right? I was open to a more mature middle ground. And really what happened is just we stopped talking, period.
Mm-hmm. So then this next part makes actually a lot of sense, because another sentence that I picked up was, it made me realize that was going on in his internal world I had no idea. To assume or judge or think that because he's not telling me or talking about it means he's not thinking about it, that was actually really unfair. Because the truth of the matter is he does think about them and he has his own things he's processing. It is not fair for me to measure or judge him in his ways.
Yeah, I would still say that's true. I think I did have a lot of awareness and understanding back then that we're all just different and we process grief differently, and we should be allowed, especially, that was still early on. And I think I was speaking directly to those first couple of years specifically. And we do need that. And grief is not pretty, and everything doesn't hit an equilibrium right away. There is a lot to kind of dance around and navigate and learn from, and things ebb and flow for a while. And so if it's messy and confusing and everyone isn't getting exactly what they need, that's actually very normal. That's why grief is so hard, because there isn't a magic pixie dust you can sprinkle on it and make it all work out. It takes work and insight and healing and growth. And I think the goal was, to get through that bumpy time, learn those things about ourselves so that we could find some way to connect again, and some way to process together, not only separately, which we never really did. But I often look back on that and think, I just didn't know, I didn't understand that a completely hands-off perspective had just as many problems as trying to come on too strong and force it and try, right? What are you thinking? What are you doing? How come you want, right? I knew that wasn't going to be productive, but I pulled so far back that I look back, and that's one of my regrets, is that I would have, and I don't know if it would have made a difference. I can't say, I'm not clairvoyant, but in my attempt to be understanding and kind and to give him space, I think it was too much space. And then resentment started building there.
That is an interesting insight, because as you were just saying, often we see people taking too much interest into the other person's grieving style or grieving habits, timeline, and so forth. And we have to pull people back and say, let them do their own way. But what you're saying was that you pulled so far back that you see now in perspective that was maybe the other side of the spectrum, and also questionable whether to or how much influence that had over both of your grievings styles and timelines. So your girls, they would be turning 16 this year.
Mm-hmm. June 24th, it would be their sweet 16.
If you look back, how would you say your grief over their loss has shaped you? And secondly, how has your grief changed and developed over all those 16 years? I mean, there's sort of basically two questions, but you can speak to either one.
Yeah, I think the biggest change has been this concept of both and the duality, that you can live with all of it in your life. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're always I don't wake up every morning and go, okay, today I choose life, or today I choose hope, but maybe tomorrow I'm going to choose grief. It's not like that. I still miss them. I still wonder about them. I still think about them. And I also live my life, pour myself into my other children, go on a walk, hit the gym, make some soup, work with my clients, plan for the future, take my son to visit college, right? And I know, because probably for about the first, I'd say 3.5 years after Aubrey Nellie died, it was a very strong sense of bittersweet all the time. Anything that was happy, beautiful, easy, fun, all those good feelings that we like to feel was immediately tainted by the sad, the loss, the frustration, the questions, the longing, the missing. And I remember thinking, is this how my life is always going to be? That even when beautiful things happen again, there's going to be a sting to them because Aubrey and Ellie are not here. And that has not been the case. there was a season of that, and it was a part of my healing process. But now it's not sort of this good and bad, right? This sting or and beauty. It's like good things happen, or even normal things happen, or blah things happen, or ordinary things. I was just telling my son the other day, he's like, Mom, our life is so ordinary. I said, I know, son, that's a wonderful thing, believe it or not.
Yeah.
Just a normal everyday life where you get up and you go to school and you go to your sports and you come home and eat dinner and your mom has chores for you. And then you talk a little bit and then you go to bed. And, my boys are even getting older. My son's about to go to college. My younger son's starting high school. And I even still peek in and say, you need to get to bed. Don't stay up too late, right? I still mother them. And he's like, our lives are just so ordinary. And I often think to myself, yeah, that's the miracle, that we have gone through such a significant loss and somehow found ourselves just living quite ordinarily, where everything isn't big and huge all the time, or sad and stingy, or overwhelming and crippling. Like there's just a lot of normal life that has built itself back into how we function every day. And that's the part that I love the most, right? Like we can have Christmas, and even though Aubrey and Ellie are dearly missed, Christmas can be wonderful. And we can laugh, and we can wrap presents, and we can decorate, and we can eat our food. And the loss is no longer stealing or robbing any of the joy. It's no longer like a balance or like, two sides of the same coin. It's just feels very ordinary. It's the only word I can come up with. And I like that. I'm proud of that. I feel like I put in a lot of work and effort to get to that simplicity again.
Yeah, because I can hear certain people watching or listening to this saying, this is not possible. How did she get there? This is never going to happen. And, the timeline is also not something that people who listen or watch this should be aspiring to. Okay, 16 years, that's how it should be. There's not a timeline that requires you to be in a certain place at a certain time. But the question is more, how did it come to this? Because I have certain people in my mind that either when they hear you, they say, this is not possible, or I cannot believe this is what Rachel's life is. But so how did it come from those years, without putting a number again to it, the years where it was bittersweet, as you mentioned it, to where you are now, where it's ordinary? Because that is not a switch. That doesn't just click over and then it's all ordinary. How did this happen?
Yeah, well, I think it happened in a couple of ways. And one of them specifically I remember is I went and I spoke at a conference. And one of the women that was in the audience came up to me after I was done speaking. And she was very upset with me. And she said to me, and this is a quote, if you loved your girls as much as I loved my son, you could never be okay again. And first of all, I remember my heart just broke for her, because I realized that wasn't even about me. That was about her pain, and she was struggling. And I don't know her story. I didn't know her personally, but I could tell that she was in a lot of pain. But also what I learned in that moment was that there is this fear in all grieving people that if you are ever okay again, then you never really loved. And the way to prove how much you loved them and how much they meant to you and how much it's hurt to not have them is modeled through how crippled you are by your pain. The more you hurt, the more you love them. And so in that moment, I gave myself 100% permission to love my children in my healing and not only in my hurting, and to resolve that fear that if I am okay again, if life ever goes back to being good or ordinary or simple, or without that constant sting and reminder that they're not here, that somehow that's because I didn't love them very much, or I didn't love them enough, or I love them less than I used to. Because I have not met a client who doesn't have this fear that if I go back to living a life that I love, they're getting forgotten, or I didn't really love them. And I've also had conversations where people flat out make those accusations to others. Well, if you're okay, you didn't love as much as I loved, right? If you loved the way I loved, if your person meant to you what my person meant to me, then, right. And now it's a judgment of love, not even capacity, not choice, not our belief that we can learn new skills or that we have the ability to heal and to change. It's this actual accusation that I'm more loving than you are. This person meant more to me than your person meant to you. And so I refuse to believe that being okay again is possible because I refuse to believe or allow myself, right, to love any less. And once I was able to just solidify in my own mind that that is not the case at all, and that my love for my girls is not tied to my pain, and that I refuse to let it be tied to my pain, I had this unbelievable freedom to live my life in a different way because I no longer had to worry about if it meant I loved them less. Because you'd have to give me a frontal lobotomy, I think, for me to stop loving them fully and wholeheartedly with every cell and fiber of my being.
Yeah.
So that sort of was the first step. And then I think, truly, I think what's been a huge part of that journey as well is I am super blessed to have a family system that is actually incredibly supportive. They bring up the girls, talk about them. And it's not like a constant everyday thing, but if their birthdays are coming up, someone's going to mention it. My mom always puts a gift under the tree for Aubrey and Ellie every Christmas. When I got married, we had this little candle set up where we honored them. And not just my girls. I had an aunt that passed away a handful of years ago, and it was just rocked our family. And right, to have them included. And so there's this ease in our family where we don't focus and dwell and demand, but just kind of by nature, they're still here with us. They're involved. Their names get mentioned. They're brought, even my boys will bring them up from time to time. And it's not a thing we feel like we have to do or a thing we try not to do. It's just a thing that we let naturally happen. And that has allowed a lot more normal life to get intertwined. Our real, actual story involves those little girls being born and then those little girls dying. And so we just let it be part of our story, but it's not our whole story. And so we let it be natural.
Exactly. Absolutely. I think from what you said previously about the love equals pain or love is tied to pain, it's one of the semantic loaded couplings where people have that tied together. It's like not even intertwined, it's coupled together. You can only love, or love is equal to the pain. And the way you described it, you really made it clear. You uncoupled it. You said, no, this is not the case for me. And I like the way you also challenge the community, especially on Instagram, to find out a little bit more. And people sometimes get agitated because their nervous system also has gotten used to this dysregulated state, chronically dysregulated state. Chronically being in that grieving can be addictive and can, for some people, mean that their nervous system doesn't find their normally regulated baseline again. They're chronically dysregulated. And so that requires work, that requires somatic work. And so one of the things that I also wanted to know is from you is one of the things that I see with people after significant loss, if they start to make something happen in their life in relation to the loss, within 7 to 10 years, this is just my observation, there is hopefully and often a transition back into maybe what you call mundane life or normal life or something else. So in your case, it was when we talked first for this interview for Grieving Parents, you were in this business at that time for tea. And then later you transitioned into also working with clients. What propelled that change, or what made you move into this direction?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things. And I think the main one is, from as far back as I can remember, I knew that I wanted to help grievers in a way that I couldn't find when I really needed help. So there was this sense of need, a little bit of a sense of urgency from the very get-go that said, I don't want people to have to go through what I went through in order to get the support that they need and find their way through. Because trying to reinvent the wheel every time we lose somebody is just not necessary. So many people have gone before us. Some of those people have been very successful at recalibrating their heart and putting the pieces of their lives back together again. We want to learn from those people. We want that information available. Now, I believe fully that if people are not interested in that information, it should not be shoved down their throats. Your journey after loss is your journey. You're allowed to choose whatever path you want. But nothing breaks my heart more than when people say to me, I didn't know that this other path was an option, right? I didn't even know healing was a choice I could have, right? And I just want them to know if they want a different way, it's there for them. And that was my motivation in creating the teas, because the teas were a tool to support their physical and emotional well-being through grief and loss. And then creating my program, which is an extension of that. My sister has the tea company. Now it's her company. And a big part of that also stems from my divorce, right? Things change. You have to make new choices. Life happens. I also think at that time too, my desire to help people through grief versus to sell tea was still, clear to me. And so we made a different plan. And my sister has been amazing. She's been nothing but supportive. I mean, it wasn't like it was some conflict or anything. It was just new choices. And that's what I've said from day one, is when we really understand the power of our choices, our life looks very different. And it looks very different in every way, because we can always make choices. We can always make new choices, even in the face of things where we didn't have a choice. How we respond becomes our most powerful choice. And we're constantly learning to respond and re-respond and then unrespond and make a new response. And it's an evolution that happens for our whole life. And that's what I hold on to the most. Like, I have no desire to tell my clients what to do, but I do want to make sure they're aware of every option available to them. And that this world opens up of, wow, I still have some choices, even if at a certain point in my life, I didn't have this choice or that choice, because that is a reality. Not everything is up to us. We don't control everything. But understanding that just because something occurs in our life that we couldn't control means that we can control nothing is a incorrect extreme. It's not the case at all. Some things we can't control, but some things we can. And it's so important to know the difference, because it's that difference that gives us the capacity to steer our lives versus allowing our lives to steer us. And I have not seen any benefits come from this hands-off approach of saying, I'm going to allow circumstances to determine how my life goes. When we take our power back and say, I'm going to have responses to these circumstances so that I determine how my life goes, it's a whole different ball game at that point. And it doesn't mean it's magical or perfect or easy, but you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning if you still believe that there's a part of your life that really is up to you, even if that part of your life is just what happens to your own heart. And I think from day one, and this is part of my personality, I realize we all have different personalities, but I'm feisty that way. Like, I believe very strongly that no one gets to tell me what to do or how to feel or how to think. And from the beginning, when people said, oh, Rachel, you'll never be okay again. Like, a mother who loses a child will never be okay. My initial gut instinct was, don't you tell me how I'm going to be. Don't you tell me what I'm going to do, right? Don't you tell me that I only have 0 options, because you're not the boss of me. So I found a different way. And I think, unfortunately, that's why I can be a little bit controversial at times in the grief space, is because I'm trying to initiate a conversation around this whole idea that grief is not stronger than you. You are stronger than grief. There's grief does not have the final say in your life. And unfortunately, not a lot of people want to hear that. And so it comes off as controversial or aggressive or things that I don't intend it to be any of those things. Like, I believe in compassion, and I believe hurting people need to be seen and to be supported. But I also don't believe in fostering what I think are detrimental or false ideas around the power we really do have over our own heart and life. And if that means that I have to rock the boat from time to time in order to get that messaging out there, I'm willing to do it, because I think it's life-changing messaging.
As I said, you should write the book.
Yeah.
So maybe one last thing to round this up. The question also, I mean, you mentioned that already. So you said you're feisty, this is your character, and other people are different. And it's a question of, in my case, from my understanding, is also to understand your own nervous system and to know where your strengths are and to work with that and to strengthen the resilience that you might not think you have, like in my case. Now, one of the things that interests me as well is who do you think you've learned that from? Were there inspirations that you had early on in your grief? Things that, like you mentioned, that woman that came up to you and said to you and something and you happened. But do you feel that was inspired by some of the things you read, you did early on, or by your upbringing? Where did that come from, that spirit?
So I think part of it is definitely the family, just the DNA strains that come down. You know, we all have certain personalities, but I was raised in a very, I'm super blessed. I really did have a very nurturing and empowering family. And I was taught from a very young age that it's okay to be accountable, but that's not a bad word. Accountability is not something that only happens when you do something wrong and you need to say you're sorry and pay, for the repercussions. That accountability just means ownership, and you get to be accountable for the good decisions you make, for the right choices, for the things you earn and work hard at, just as much as accountability if you make a mistake or learn the hard way or whatever it is. And I was also raised in a family with a lot of natural medicine and nutrition and health, like a big focus on health, which is also why in my program, I emphasize, just like you were talking a minute ago, like that central nervous system regulation is huge, and somatic work, but also nutrition work, helping our body get the support it needs when it is going through grief is huge, because oftentimes we will come to conclusions about what we're able to do and handle and what our capacity is from a depleted state, because grief has worn us down so much. Mm-hmm. And if we can rebuild that, get the right nutrition and supplements and rest and boundaries and not over exercise and get all of those extra modalities that help put our physical health back together again, then we get this greater awareness, like, oh my gosh, if I'm taking care of my body, I have emotional capacities I didn't know that I had. And it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight, but we can get ourselves to a place where we thought we never could be. And so I think having a family that, one, supported my ability to say, I don't want to be put in a box. I don't want somebody to tell me what I can and cannot do. And for them to say, okay, right, we're here. Why don't you try? And then also say things like, well, are you taking care of yourself? Are you eating right? Are you resting? Are you doing the most basic things? Because not everything comes from our willpower. And that's another misnomer, I think, that somehow it's our willpower that drives us through our grief experience. And it isn't. It's a lot of things. Willpower being one of the most minimal of them all, because willpower runs out really fast. Motivation runs out. We need a stronger foundation than that. And so the health work is a good foundation. Support is another foundation. And then because I had a lot of functionality in my upbringing, boundaries are not as much of a struggle for me as they are for some people. And we do, like with my clients, we do a lot of boundary work, and we work through a lot of codependency, because people come in with this belief that either about themselves or that they have this job or this work to make sure everyone else feels okay and make sure everybody else understands. And I'm the one that pulls them way back from that. And not that I encourage people to be uncaring by any regard. I think kindness is one of the most powerful forces in the universe. But it isn't my job, and I knew this early on, it is not my job to make everyone else feel okay about my grief and my grief journey. I am the one that had to wake up every morning and be accountable to the life that I chose to lead, not anybody else. And so if they were uncomfortable, if they disagreed with my perspective, if they felt I was drinking too many cups of tea, if they thought I should get on prescription medication instead of take herbal medicine or whatever it is, it was much easier for me to just sort of say, no, thank you, and stick to at least my path, because I wanted to be accountable. I wanted to be able to say, I took all of the steps, went through all of the things, and then when I made certain decisions, they were because they were informed and intentional. Because I felt like that's all I had after having no power watching my little girls get very, very sick and pass away and having to make horrible decisions like to leave them on life support or to take them off life support. And that was a horrible time when I learned what it feels like to be truly powerless. And I recognize that life has some of those moments, but it also has moments where we have great power and great say. And I wasn't going to let those pass me by just because I had a season where I didn't get all the choices I wanted. And that stuck. And I raised my children that way. I help coach my clients that way, that it really is up to you and only you get to decide. And I'm just here to support you and equip you so that you're making informed and intentional decisions.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for all that you shared today as well. I think I could listen to you forever. And I think it's important that people know about the choices that they have, as you were saying before, even I think before we started recording today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I love anytime we get to sit and talk. It's one of my favorite things. And I cannot believe that we have had a professional and friendship for over a decade now. That's pretty amazing.
That is.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to our newsletter on nataliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Natalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.